Hello, APBIO. This is the final chapter in Unit 7. So we're just going to finish up our conversation, our current conversation of natural selection. So you should be here in your supplemental notes packet, chapter 26, which has the lab attached. And I'm going to talk about the study of evolutionary relationship, the study of what we call phylogeny. It makes sense to actually finish up our conversation of how organisms change over time with a system that looks at essentially the path organisms took to change and then attempts to name and classify all of those different organisms. And that's what chapter 26 is about. Essentially, all organisms are organized using two systems of classification. The first system is phylogeny. And phylogeny is just the history of the changes, evolutionary changes, so the allele frequency changes of a species or a group of species based on similarities and differences, their physical differences, the phenotypes and genotypes. So phylogeny looks at both morphological characteristics, anatomical characteristics, as well as DNA sequences, their genotypes. And it uses diagrams to actually communicate the hypothesis of relatedness. So we call that model, that diagram, a phylogenetic tree, and it's just a diagram of the hypothesis of evolutionary relatedness. You can think of it as a pictorial hypothesis. So it's a picture of the history of evolution. And this phylogenetic tree, we've been looking at it all year long, and it's showing you all organisms in all of the three domains. So there's three big categories of living organisms. You can see it here, three big categories of living organisms. And there are a couple things interesting things that this claims, that this pictorial hypothesis is making. First of all, it's telling you, or telling the person who's interpreting it, that all of these organisms are more closely related to each other than they are to these branches over here. And then likewise, everything on this red branch is more closely related to each other than it is to either the purple or the brown. And then everything on the brown branch is more closely related than it is to these. It's also telling you that if we look at how all of these branches are connected, this is a rooted phylogenetic tree, which is claiming that all of these organisms in all of these categories up here are all related by a common ancestor. And if you recall from the beginning of the year and then throughout the year, we've been calling this ancestor down here LUCA, Last Universal Common Ancestor. And it's just a picture of, like I said, of a hypothesis of evolutionary relatedness. And it's saying that all living organisms, this root right here is saying that all living organisms descended from a common ancestor, who we call Luca. Now, if we look a little bit more at this same picture right here, drawn slightly differently, but it's the same thing. Here's our last universal common ancestor down here. It's naming again the three domains. So thinking about just where we've been in our unit, let's think about this for a second. What process do you think each of the nodes represent? So let me show you where a node is. So a node is just each place where a branch comes off. So thinking about unit 7, let's think about what is that? What is that called when one organism is going along swimmingly or going along, and then there's enough change where it splits into two different things? What do we call that? And if you answered speciation, you're right, that's a speciation event. So a phylogenetic tree is showing each time when there's been enough change that you end up with actually two species coming from a single species. So one species doesn't evolve from another, but one species evolves into two species, right? That's speciation. The other question that I have for you is, if we look again to try to interpret this diagram, what are the major features of organisms that we use to classify them at the domain level? So like, for example, why is all this bacteria, what is the difference between the morphological difference between this bacteria here and this archaea? Maybe these reds and these yellow here, the bacteria and the archaea, as compared to the eukarya. Pause the video for a second and think about that. Now, your answer should have been that the eukarya have a nucleus, true, eu meaning true, and then karya meaning kernel, and then the bacteria and the archaea together make up the prokaryotes. That's before the kernel. So we have no true nucleus here and then a nucleus here. So you can see the pictorial hypothesis is showing you a picture of that. That's the claim, that these organisms over in the eukarya, these organisms that are composed of these types of cells, all have nuclei, and these are all non-nucleated. They have a nucleoid region. Now, interestingly, when we think about all of these living organisms, all the species that have ever existed on Earth, it's believed that about 90 to 99% are now extinct. And we looked at some of those, the evidence of those extinct organisms in chapter 25, and we also talked about the current great extinction that's ongoing, and how humans' impact is impacting the rate at which species are going extinct. So looking at evolutionary relatedness and classifying organisms by evolutionary relatedness is one science of classification. The science that actually gives organisms names is called taxonomy. And it's just the science of actually classifying organisms. And it's based on phylogeny. Now, it should be noted, and I even wrote it down here in bold, taxonomy doesn't always reflect evolutionary relationships because we're not always right. So often the taxonomy is a shifting science where when new information about relatedness is uncovered, then scientists will rename things. In any case, you'll see artifacts of that a lot of times. If you're studying organisms, you'll see, oh, it used to be classified this way, and now it's classified this way. And it's typically because we didn't know some type of information. Often it's information about genotypes that is currently now causing scientists to reclassify, rename organisms. So now let's talk about that naming system. It's called taxonomy because it's this hierarchy of inclusive categories. And each of the categories is called a taxon. That's what each level is called. And the largest taxon is the domains. So there's 3 major domains. And then the one step up from that, the next slightly more exclusive category is the category of, or the taxon of kingdom. And then we have phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. And you can remember that as King or Dear King Philip came over for green spaghetti, or there's lots of different ways. In your reading guide, it actually asks you to come up with your own, but that's one, the one I know. In any case, you can make up your own. But this hierarchy of inclusive categories is based in Latin. But the question is, why do we have to have this elaborate classification system? Why can't we just use common names for organisms? And let's just use our own language, because that's what we're speaking, and let's just consider the term fish as a way to illustrate why common names really just don't work. So let's start with starfish. First of all, starfish is not a fish. It's an echinoderm in the class Asteroidea. And you don't have to know the phylum or the class, but you should know it's not a fish. And some people even call them sea stars because they're really just not a fish. Jellyfish that we just talked about in our PGLO lab are also not a fish. They're in the Cnidaria. They're not fish. Fish have backbone, right? If you've ever seen the skeleton of a fish, it's a vertebrate. And jellyfish don't. They're soft-bodied organisms. A silverfish is also not a fish. It's an insect, and it may or may not be running around in your basement. They're certainly running around in the basement of CVU. They're kind of gross. They're all kind of silvery and slithery, and I don't know, somehow they gross me out. But then finally we get to catfish, and catfish is a fish, but it's certainly not a cat. So you can see how we really can't use common names. It's confusing, and plus there's a language barrier because different people, if they're talking about an organism, they might be referring to the same organism or different organisms and not know it. So we have a sort of a languageless naming system. It's its own language that was developed by Carl Linnaeus I don't remember when. I should have written the date down. But he developed a system of what's called binomial nomenclature. And in binomial nomenclature, we use this hierarchy of inclusive categories, and then all the way down to a species name. A species name always has two names. That's why it's called binomial, bi meaning two, nomial, two named, and two naming system. And every single organism has it as a noun and an adjective to describe it. So let's use humans as a way to explore this hierarchy of inclusive categories of the Carl Linnaeus' nomenclature system. So like I said, let's use humans as an example. So the domain humans are in the eukaryota, that we know. You probably also know that humans are in the animal kingdom. We also call it the metazoa, the multicellular animals. And then we are in the chordata phylum. We're just vertebrates. You probably already knew that. You already know, I'm sure, that we're in the mammals, the mammalia, and we're primates. We talked about the other day that there were the only extant species of the Hominidae family. So there's only one left, us. So we're in the family Hominidae, and then our genus is the Homo genus. And then our specific epithet, so our adjective. So let's talk a little bit about that. So like I said, every species has a noun and an adjective, and it's written noun adjective. The first letter of a species name is always capitalized, and then everything else is lowercase. And if you're printing it, handwriting it, then it's underlined, or if you are using a computer typing it, you can either italicize it or underline it. It's typically italicized. And it's always noun first and then adjective. So the genus is always the first, that's the noun, capital. In humans, it's Homo. And then the specific epithet, which is the adjective, is sapiens, which means wise. So it's man wise, wise man, that's the name of our species. The species name is both of them together. So together we are Homo sapiens. It's a two-name system. And that is the binomial nomenclature, or Linnaeus's nomenclature system. Okay, that's it for taxonomy. Now let's go back into phylogeny. What our lab for this last chapter and this last part of our natural selection unit, we're going to explore phylogenetic relationships. And so we're going to look at phylogenetics trees. It's important to note that, like I said earlier, we're going to use both phenotypic data and genotypic data to generate these pictorial hypotheses. And it's what you need to be able to do after you do this lab is to be able to interpret phylogenetic trees. That's the goal of the lab. So to get you sort of help you understand phylogenetic trees, the first thing I want you to do is go to slide number 75 in your class presentation and click on the interactive model. And I'd like for you to just read through the slides and click on the short videos to clarify understanding of what phylogenetic trees, how scientists generate phylogenetic trees from DNA sequences. So do that first,